Hey there, welcome to That Dang Dad. My name is Phil, and if my video analytics are any guide, you all would like for me to keep talking about my time in law enforcement. Fine. Tonight I just wanted to address some miscellaneous questions that I've gotten about police work, police culture, police abolition, other kinds of questions that I've gotten since my last videos. About 97% of you engaged with me in really good faith, had really thoughtful things to say, and I really appreciate it, and I wanted to address some of your questions and concerns. I'm also going to post a little table of contents in the description in case you want to skip around, or even better, if you want to link people to specific topics that I address. Well, anyway, let's get to it. In my video on police abolition, I poked a little fun at people who, when they hear someone is a police and prison abolitionist, always say something like, what about the murderers? As if no one had ever thought of that. I went on to quote some responses from Angela Y. Davis and criticalresistance.org, but some of you felt that I did not adequately offer an explanation or any kind of alternative, and felt that I kind of brushed that question away a little too quickly. Fair enough. I will go back to two nugs that I quoted in that video, though. Angela Davis says to posit decarceration as our overarching strategy, and to remove the prison from the social and ideological landscapes of society. And Critical Resistance says to think about what we must build instead of what we want to destroy. So that's why I think it was hard for me to give a concise answer to what about the murderers, because I can imagine a world in which everyone's social, financial, and mental health needs are met without shame, such that there would be no incentive to steal, hurt, or kill others for the vast majority of people. I believe that if people's needs are met, the desperation and scarcity stress that sometimes drives people to do bad things will vanish. Activist Angel Parker goes a little further and puts it like this. She says, "Murder and sexual violence are extremely contextual. There cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution to harm, especially when that size includes enslavement and torture of millions of people. The carceral system is used to tackle every societal issue that we have: homelessness, drug addiction and trafficking, violence, poverty, abuse, etc. We cannot address all these issues with one institution, and abolition requires us to be creative enough to envision a world free of the carceral system." In the US, we tend to primarily focus on revenge rather than caring for survivors. What good does it do a survivor for the state to spend endless amounts of money incarcerating their abuser if they are still unable to heal because they don't have access to mental health resources, stable income, and shelter? Imagine a survivor whose version of accountability looks like trauma treatment and alcohol addiction treatment from their abuser instead of jail. For a family whose loved one was murdered, imagine the person who harmed them was required to help support them financially while they adjust and heal. Imagine folks who are trained in violence intervention strategies called to intervene in volatile situations and resolving the issue both immediately and over time. Imagine comprehensive, culturally responsive parenting courses and counseling, both as a preventative measure before birth and as a result of a parent who has engaged in neglect or child abuse. Imagine mentorship and educational resources for teens and young adults who took a life. Imagine a community fund to support survivors of violence financially. Prison is a relatively new phenomenon here. Native and indigenous communities have functioned for centuries without the carceral system and have pioneered models of restorative and transformative justice that keep their communities safe. So that's why it's sometimes hard to answer the question, what are we going to do with all the murderers? Because the answer is something like, whatever we need to do to keep people safe and healthy. That said, a few of you theorize that even in post-scarcity, fully automated luxury communism, it's likely that at least a few people might have antisocial tendencies that just can't fully be managed with medicine and mental health care. That theoretically there might still be serial killers and serial abusers. This is where, for me anyway, Davis's quote about removing prison from the ideological landscape comes in. Because I acknowledge, for the good of the community, we have to address bad actors in our midst. If social work and mental health care for some reason fail to mitigate those bad behaviors, it may be necessary to house those people away from the community. But if we're positing decarceration as our strategy, it would mean that we're not housing these people in a place of shame and retribution, but in an environment to keep them safe, to meet their needs, and to hopefully help them reintegrate eventually. Dr. Don C. Gibbons, chairman of the Department of Sociology at Portland State University and former director of the Staff Training School of Osceola Prison Farm in Canada, estimated that about 10% of the current prison population used violence as their main mode of expression. Imagine the kinds of hyper-specific supervision and care systems we could create for those people if we weren't also housing 2.1 million other people at the same time. My personal version of prison abolition is one that doesn't pretend that antisocial behaviors don't exist, just that they don't mean that the entire person is irrevocably evil and undeserving of dignity. I just want us to design a harm response system that starts from a new prompt. Instead of, how can we make someone pay for their sins? Let's start from, how can we heal the harm that has been done and prevent it from happening again in the future? There's a sentiment you hear nowadays that goes something like, look, law enforcement needs an overhaul, but when you say defund the police, it's too extreme. You're turning people off to your message by taking it too far. And I'll grant you this, the first time I heard phrases like abolish the police and defund the police, I scoffed, I rolled my eyes, I tut-tutted, I exclaimed preposterous, and my monocle flew out. For people who are very comfortable with the status quo like I was, yes, it's an extreme statement. And that's why I like it. It's extreme, and that's why it worms its way into your head. How could someone say that? It's provocative, it demands a response. And yeah, the first time someone hears it, it's probably going to provoke a negative response. But as it stays in the public consciousness for longer and longer, it demands more and more engagement. As more and more prominent, non-fringy people say it, it gets harder and harder to dismiss outright. Have you ever wondered why Coke and Pepsi spend billions of dollars to advertise their products as if none of us have ever heard of their brands before? It's because they know that repetition creates a subtle sense of legitimacy over time. Think about walking into Alabama or Mississippi in 1830 and exclaiming, "Abolish slavery!" It would be equally shocking to the farmers of that day. They'd say, "Impossible, our whole society is built around this institution. Where would they all go? What would we do? How would we make a living? You're asking too much. We should just sort of incrementally reform non-consensual employment." But over time, the abolition movement grew into a powerful force that demanded more and more engagement from society at large. And eventually, it won. Nowadays, being against that kind of slavery is very normal, very mainstream. Abolitionists fought for decades to normalize an abnormal idea. I think the defund the police movement is part of that tradition, and I think that we're just in the middle part right now. But if it's the right thing to do, then I'm more worried about advocating for the value of a good idea than I am about trying to hide what I really believe in. Besides, I think defund the police is just like one catchy jingle away from catching on with the mainstream.
Oh, I wish we just defund police tomorrow and use that budget on community to feed and house and dignify our neighbors. So say it loud and proud, ACAB.
Sometimes people ask me, what do I expect good cops to do? Are they just supposed to quit? Shouldn't we try to infiltrate law enforcement and change it from within? To be honest with you, I don't have a prescription for this. If you're a cop who is somehow a leftist, I can't tell you how to square that circle. If you're one of the good ones, you feel like you're moving your department in a progressive direction, and that works for you, great. You do you, may 1,000 flowers bloom and all that. Besides, in the grind of capitalism, when we're all just trying to feed our families and keep our heads above water, I'm hesitant to demand that people quit their entire careers. Although I do make an exception for the ICE agents who are working the concentration camps along our southern border. Quit, you fucking ghouls. Just speaking from my experience, though, law enforcement is not capable of being fixed by a few good apples. Whistleblowers can address specific wrongs at specific places, but my problem is with the structure of law enforcement as a concept and its use in society as a cudgel against people that society tends to leave behind. No one good cop can fix the fact that in many cities, police are the only 24/7 response that someone can call if someone else is having a mental health crisis. No one whistleblower can fix the fact that in the United States, poverty is criminalized, and that something as minor as a speeding ticket for a poor person can spiral into a vortex of arrests, incarceration, job loss, housing loss, and total desperation. So what do I expect people to do? I expect them to do whatever it takes to put food on the table. That's why we need a political movement on the outside to push these changes. And you know what? That probably means that we need to establish some kind of exit funds for cops who do want to quit. We're probably going to have to pool some money together and create a landing strip for cops that want to get out. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to make them fight against their own material interests. A lot of people have asked whether I think my experience in law enforcement is the same at like every police department in the United States. And the answer is probably not. I worked in a dense urban environment with a predominantly poor, non-white community, and as guardians of the status quo, that meant we were pretty tough on them. Our community didn't have a lot of extra intervention options besides the police, so we tended to get called out to keep the peace with a pretty heavy hand. I imagine there are plenty of rich white towns where the police department isn't quite as rough as we were. I'm sure there's even police departments in small, tight-knit communities that really do feel connected with their neighbors and really do want to help instead of hurt. However, you know I'm a broken record on this. It's about the structure, not the individual, and I extend that to individual police departments. I'm glad that there are departments that choose not to be as rowdy as my old one, but I don't even want that to be an option for people. Wouldn't you agree that it's not right that wealth and whiteness increase your chances of avoiding state violence? Don't you think every community deserves to feel safe and served by their local agencies? I think I've mentioned this in a few of my videos, but I'm very skeptical of the notion that if we just pay for more training, that will stop a lot of the excesses and abuses of law enforcement. Yes, there are probably some very necessary training overhauls needed for things like helping people with disabilities and mental health issues. There are issues where a police officer is not well trained on recognizing that something isn't a crime, but rather a body or a brain episode that deserves care instead of confrontation. It's just that, from my experience, the problems in law enforcement are cultural and, yeah, I'm gonna say it again, structural. I think I mentioned in a previous video, most of our training was just a watch commander slapping a DVD in and us dicking around on our phones until it was over. And this included everything from dealing with mental health issues to sexual harassment training. When we were required to pass a test on the material, Sarge just gave us the answers so that we all passed with a 100. Understand that any changes to training, any incremental reforms, any individual policy tweaks are just going to be absorbed and ignored by the rank and file cops in most agencies. The more compliant agencies will incur the wrath of powerful police unions, and the less compliant agencies will face the same level of administrative and societal consequences that they do now, which is almost none. For a lot of my law enforcement videos, I think people have had a very reasonable reaction, which is something along the lines of, okay, you want to abolish prisons and police, but we can't just do that tomorrow, so what do we do in the meantime? And yeah, fair point, my vision of abolition is one that comes in many iterations. For police specifically, I think the first thing in the United States that we could do almost immediately is to end the concept of qualified immunity for cops who do unjustified killings on duty. If you don't know, qualified immunity says that if a police officer makes a mistake in the line of duty, they typically cannot be held personally responsible for that mistake, even if that mistake was, say, murdering a sleeping EMT in her bed, like my local law enforcement agency did. Most police officers who murder someone will never face criminal prosecution for what they've done, and qualified immunity makes sure that they won't even see financial consequences for that. From my experience, cops being cavalier about killing bad guys on duty is a huge cultural problem, and I think one way to mitigate that is to say to the cops, okay, be ready to kill, but be ready to get out your wallet if you make a mistake. Another issue is the power of police unions. They make sure that not only do cops never see criminal or financial consequences for their bad behavior, they rarely see professional consequences for it either. And no, police unions are not legitimate labor unions in my opinion. Why? Because who does Capital call to break strikes and to hassle labor leaders? You guessed it, the cops. The AFL-CIO should disavow law enforcement unions immediately. Also, isn't it a little unseemly that police unions can raise money for the city council members and the mayors who are supposed to be holding them accountable? Seems a bit like a conflict of interest if you can just pay off the people that are supposed to regulate you, but I guess that's the American way, huh? On the cultural side of things, I think the whole certification and training process needs an overhaul. My entire training period in law enforcement, the idea of officer safety above all else was drilled into us. Better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6, they'd say, meaning better to take your chances in court than to risk getting hurt or killed in the line of duty. Academies and departments hire guys like Dave Grossman, who's a guy with a mega boner for police killings, to get cops excited to kill on duty, to feel proud to do it. So it doesn't matter what the official training manual says about use of force and when you get to use it. Culturally, law enforcement encourages its members to err on the side of civilian death rather than officer death. So I think another thing that we can do is to target the peace officer standards and training commissions in our local states with campaigns and direct action. These are the state agencies that regulate the licensing, training, and a lot of the sort of policy creation for law enforcement agencies within that state. Like, why are the people helping to write police policy all DAs, chiefs, and ex-cops? Why are cops holding cops accountable when we know that cops will always protect each other against you, the civilian, if there's ever a dispute or a complaint? The entire system, from the classroom to the courtroom, is set up to benefit killer cops over their victims. But frankly, I think that real, lasting change is only going to come through sustained activism, sustained direct action, and an unflagging effort to make city, state, and federal agencies miserable. This means filming cops constantly, filing complaints constantly, donating to bail funds, donating lawyer fees, campaigning against cop-friendly district attorneys, suing departments, suing cities, educating the public on police abuses, educating jurors on jury nullification, fighting back against propaganda, and just basically doing our part to make law enforcement less attractive, less prestigious, and less fun. This is long-term stuff, and for us in the US, it's going to be full of heartbreaks as long as we have a conservative Supreme Court. But if you're asking what we can do for now, until the revolution, those are some ideas we can try. I read a quote from a Black Lives Matter activist in the thick of the 2020 protests, and they said something like, "I want you out here because you love black lives, not because you hate cops." And that's how I'm trying to be with my own activism. I am not, as some people have claimed, a bitter ex-cop who is lashing out at my former friends because of some unresolved grievances. These videos that I've done critiquing law enforcement and advising on how to reduce its power are not motivated by my need to hurt cops, but by my compassion for victims of the carceral state. I look at generations of black kids sucked away by the school-to-prison pipeline in the United States. I look at indigenous activists being brutalized by public and private police forces for the crime of protecting their water from pollution. I look at the trauma that my trans friends have suffered in a prison system that exposes them to abuse and denies them life-saving health care. I look at what ICE is doing to torture refugees and desperate parents at our southern border, what they're doing to kids that are the same age as my daughter, and yeah, I'm pissed at law enforcement. But I'm also trying to center the black kids, the water protectors, the trans people, the sex workers, the refugees, to fight for their dignity, to fight for their right to thrive. So one other answer for what do we do in the meantime is to ask those folks, find out what they need, find out what resources they're lacking, find out what state and local agencies are failing them, find out which politicians are targeting them, and just let them lead that conversation and write our prescriptions. So that said, I'm not sure how many more cop videos I have left in me. My goal in making these videos has been to introduce ideas and to break down intellectual barriers for people by being a white ex-cop who's telling you that, yeah, these Black Lives Matter protesters have a point. I've always felt that my role is to clear a path for people to be able to hear black voices, indigenous voices, undocumented voices, trans voices, refugee voices, disabled voices, all of whom are screaming that the carceral state is crushing them. So yeah, when I see opportunities to clear more paths, I might take them, but seriously, if you find even like 5% of my police critiques compelling or interesting, your task now is to listen to the activists on the ground and find out more from them. But anyway, I really appreciate you engaging with the ideas, even if they're still a little too spicy for you. Like I said in my last abolition video, I don't think you're a bad person if this stuff is a bridge too far right now. I'd love your support for the reforms, and if you're not down for the revolution right now, no hard feelings. Let's start building a better world together today, and we can negotiate further down at the crossroads when we get to it. Anyway, if you give this video a like and comment on it, helps expose it to more people. Feel free to get into flame wars in the comments, that helps a lot actually. Sharing the video with people that you think might find it interesting or compelling, great way to help get the message out there. And hey, depending on where you live, it's getting cold out there and millions of people are facing an eviction crisis this holiday season. So look up your local mutual aid organizations, and if you're in a position to do it, please donate. Please help out your neighbors who might find themselves homeless this winter. Anywho, I really appreciate you spending your time with me, and hope to see you on the next one. Good night.
Oh, I wish we just defund police tomorrow and use that budget on community to feed and house and dignify our neighbors. So say it loud and proud, ACAB.